World War II was a theater of unprecedented destruction, where each day brought new challenges and demanded unparalleled ingenuity. The summer of 1944 was marked by the triumphant Allied landings in Normandy, and now their armies were rapidly advancing deep into Europe. It seemed nothing could stop the victorious march of armored columns, but the reality of the Western Front was far more complex. Nothing hampered the offensive as significantly as rivers. Dozens of water obstacles, each transformed into an impregnable fortress by the Germans, threatened to halt the advance. These rivers became a true logistical nightmare. The retreating Wehrmacht employed a scorched earth tactic with ruthless efficiency. Bridges were blown sky high, turning into heaps of twisted metal and concrete. Every bank was transformed into a defensive line, awaiting the Allies with mortars, machine guns, and artillery. On the opposite side, the enemy fortified positions, ready to unleash a barrage of fire upon any attempt at crossing. Time was the chief enemy, and every delay at a water barrier granted the Germans precious hours and days for regrouping and constructing new defensive lines. The mighty M4 Sherman tanks, the steel fists of the Allies, found themselves useless, trapped on one bank, their firepower and mobility rendered moot. The best engineers racked their brains over this problem, proposing complex and time-consuming solutions, but none could provide the necessary speed and surprise. It was a stalemate that threatened to prolong the war for months, until one crazy engineer proposed an idea that seemed pure absurdity, but forever changed the rules of war, allowing American tanks to cross rivers in mere minutes. The summer of 1944 promised the Allies a swift march across Europe after the successful Normandy landings. German forces, battered by heavy fighting, were in retreat, but they did so not in disarray, but with chilling calculation. Every kilometer of advance, every hill, and every village was ready to become another bloody landmark. Yet, nothing hampered the offensive as effectively as the natural water barriers, the countless rivers and canals crisscrossing France and the Benelux countries. And the Germans knew how to turn these waterways into impassable obstacles. Their tactic was simple and devastatingly effective, the scorched earth strategy. During their retreat, all bridges, from grand railway viaducts to humble rural crossings, were systematically destroyed. Explosions boomed one after another, sending columns of smoke and debris into the sky, leaving behind only twisted structures and wide expanses of water. Rivers like the Seine, the Rhine, the Moselle became not just obstacles, but deadly traps. And while Allied engineers desperately assessed the scale of the destruction, on the opposite bank of the river, the Wehrmacht wasted no time. Every bank was transformed into a meticulously prepared defensive line. Trenches bit into the earth, machine gun nests were camouflaged among the trees, and artillery batteries were aimed at every possible crossing point. German soldiers, often seasoned veterans, waited, ready to unleash a barrage of fire upon any attempt to cross the watery expanse. Bridges were destroyed, but bridges were not their main problem. The problem was that now every subsequent meter of open space was mortally dangerous, and a dash across the water was suicidal. In this ruthless chess game, time became the Allies' chief enemy. Every delay at a river granted the Germans invaluable hours and days. This allowed them not only to fortify new defensive lines, but also to transfer fresh reinforcements, regroup surviving panzer divisions, and establish new, deeply echeloned positions. The advantage of speed that the Allied blitzkrieg offered, their air superiority, and numerical advantage in equipment, melted away with every minute of procrastination. The onslaught of powerful armored columns, capable of tearing through kilometers of defenses, halted at the water, negating all their firepower and mobility. The Germans watched with sneering satisfaction as the mighty M4 Shermans impotently idled on one bank, transforming from formidable weapons into vulnerable targets. Time was working for the Third Reich, and the Allies desperately needed a solution to break this stalemate. In the grand symphony of the Allied advance across Western Europe, M4 Sherman tanks played the role of powerful, Udarnik Instrumentov. These medium tanks, produced in astounding numbers in American factories, were the steel fists of the armored divisions, whose appearance on the battlefield often marked a turning point in a local engagement. Their mission was clear: to punch through deep echeloned enemy defenses, provide fire support to advancing infantry, clear fortified positions, and rapidly push deep into enemy territory, turning a tactical breakthrough into an operational encirclement. Thanks to their versatility, relatively good armor, and powerful gun, Shermans were the primary tool in the Allied doctrine for maintaining a high pace of offensive and preventing the Wehrmacht from regrouping. Each of the thousands of such tanks embodied the unyielding will of the American war machine. However, all this power, all this versatility, and relentless thrust instantly evaporated the moment a Sherman found itself on the bank of a river or a wide canal. These machines, designed for land warfare, were utterly incapable of fording water obstacles. For a 30-ton tank built of thick steel, water was an insurmountable element. The Sherman's hull, designed to withstand shells and bullets, was not watertight and lacked sufficient buoyancy to keep such a mass afloat. It was a land predator that transformed into a helpless giant at the water's edge. It was in such moments, when German machine guns and artillery shelled the crossings and the Shermans stood, their guns pointed uselessly at the opposite bank, that these formidable machines transformed from weapons of victory into impotent steel monsters. Their crews, hardened by battle, watched helplessly as their comrades in the infantry, deprived of much-needed armored support, suffered heavy casualties. Soldiers tried to cross the river in light assault boats, under fire, or on improvised rafts, with every meter of open water representing a deadly barrier. Every hour of delay, every sunset that caught the tank columns at the water's edge, resulted for the Allies not only in the loss of precious time, but also in dozens, if not hundreds of lives. Military engineers and designers, acutely aware of the problem's urgency, certainly did not stand idle. Various alternatives were developed on both sides of the Atlantic, but all were far from ideal. Cumbersome ferries, capable of transporting 1 or 2 tanks, were incredibly slow. Their assembly required specialized heavy equipment, skilled engineering crews, and significant time. And the ferries themselves were extremely vulnerable to enemy bombardment and artillery fire. Any attempt to cross became a long, arduous operation, where the initiative lay with the Germans. Attempts to create fully amphibious tanks were also made, but these prototypes suffered from a host of drawbacks. They were either too light and thinly armored to be effective on the battlefield, or they had low speed in the water, poor maneuverability, and were too complex and expensive for mass production. None of these solutions could cope with the scale of the problem, could not provide the rapid, mass, and relatively safe river crossings that were absolutely necessary to maintain the deadly pace of the offensive on the Western Front. The stalemate remained a stalemate, and every river became a new frontier where the Allied offensive power crashed against the simple physics of water, the steel nerves of the German defense, and the ingenuity of their destruction tactics. While deadly battles raged on the Western Front, and Allied tank columns stalled helplessly at water obstacles, a man lived in Britain whose name was known only to a narrow circle of military engineers and automotive enthusiasts. This was Nicholas Straussler, or, as he was also known, Nicholas Straussler, a Hungarian inventor who had emigrated to Great Britain. He was a figure seemingly completely out of place in the strict military hierarchy and pragmatic atmosphere of wartime. Straussler was the epitome of eccentricity, a man whose thoughts always outpaced existing technologies and perceptions. His reputation as a dreamer, or eccentric, was well earned. He saw the world not as it was, but as it could be, if people dared to think beyond conventional boundaries. His ideas often provoked bewilderment and sometimes outright ridicule, but it was in this unconventional approach that his true genius lay. He was one of those rare minds who were not afraid to be laughed at if it led to a solution that others considered impossible. Straussler was no stranger to unusual inventions. Long before World War II, he had managed to patent a number of innovative and at times quite whimsical designs. Among his early works were astonishing projects of all-terrain vehicles and amphibious equipment, which demonstrated his obsession with overcoming obstacles. He experimented with independent suspensions for automobiles, developed track systems to convert ordinary trucks into off-road vehicles, and created concepts for vehicles capable of moving both on land and water. For instance, he devised a system for transforming a light car into an amphibious vehicle using inflatable floats, an idea that many at the time deemed impractical, but which foreshadowed later developments. His work was often too expensive or complex for mass production of that era, but each piece underscored his pursuit of versatility and vehicle autonomy. It was this restless spirit of invention, this tireless pursuit of the impossible, that ultimately led him to the idea that would change the face of tank warfare. Straussler did not merely seek to improve existing machines, he wanted to make them do what they were, by all laws of physics and engineering at the time, simply incapable of doing. He dreamed of tanks that would not stop before rivers, of combat vehicles that could cross water obstacles with the same ease with which they traversed the battlefield. His previous experiments with amphibious technology, though not always successful, had paved the way for that very crazy idea that was destined to solve the Allies' most acute logistical nightmare. In a stuffy, smoke-filled conference room, where even the air seemed steeped in the scent of old maps and tobacco, Nicholas Straussler, that restless genius with an unvarying glint in his eyes, presented his idea. Outside, it was 1943, a time when every minute of delay at the rivers of the Western Front cost lives and slowed the inevitable defeat of Nazism. The problem of crossing water obstacles for M4 Sherman tanks had become not just a logistical challenge, but a true strategic stalemate. And now, Straussler proposed a solution that, in the opinion of many present, should have belonged not to an engineer, but to a patient in a mental asylum. He wasn't suggesting spending years and millions building a new, costly amphibious tank from scratch. His crazy proposition was to take the existing, formidable M4 Sherman, a 30-ton behemoth of armor steel, and make it float. And not with some complex pontoons, built-in watertight compartments, or futuristic hovercraft technology. By a method, he claimed, surprisingly simple and effective, with the help of a collapsible canvas screen. Yes, canvas, the very material used for tents, truck covers, and equipment tarps, a material that, by definition, should not have been able to support the weight of a tank. Straussler stood before high-ranking military engineers, generals, and bureaucrats from the UK and US War Departments. Their faces were inscrutable masks of skepticism, behind which hid outright disbelief. He explained how a tall, waterproof screen would be erected around the tank's steel hull, which could be raised or lowered in a matter of minutes, creating something akin to a temporary boat. And for propulsion in the water, a pair of compact propellers, driven by the tank's own engine. A silence fell in the room, heavy as a thunderous sky. Then, the silence was broken first by isolated coughs, then by muffled chuckles, escalating into open laughter. A tank. On canvas? Mr. Straussler, are you serious? A general's voice cut through the air, a mix of astonishment and thinly veiled irritation. That's pure suicide. 30 tons of steel are supposed to float on a piece of fabric. What absurdity. It will sink with the first wave, even before it gets close to the bank. Another officer, more sarcastic, muttered, "Perhaps we should ask the tank crews to row with paddles, or tie life rafts to them." Words expressing the general sentiment hung in the air like acrid cigarette smoke. How could such a heavy behemoth be expected to stay afloat, let alone overcome a river's current under fire, relying solely on cloth? The idea seemed not just impractical, but outright insane, straight out of science fiction or even parody. Generals and officials, accustomed to the solidity, predictability, and massiveness of military solutions, could not accept such a radical concept. It contradicted all their notions of military hardware, common sense, and even the laws of physics as they understood them. But Nicholas Straussler was not one to give in to the pressure of skeptics or laughter. His face remained imperturbable, and his eyes held the same unyielding fire as that of an inventor who sees something that remains hidden from others. He was convinced of his righteousness and ready to defend it to the last. Patiently but firmly, he began his counteroffensive. He pulled out meticulously prepared blueprints, diagrams, and graphs from his briefcase. He demonstrated models, perhaps even with working screen deployment mechanisms, showing how it could be rapidly raised and lowered, and how the propellers could effectively push the tank. Straussler explained that the main point was not for the tank itself to float. That would be impossible. His genius lay in creating sufficient displacement volume around it, using a lightweight, durable, and quickly deployable material. He spoke of hidden potential, of buoyancy calculations, of how water pressure, distributed over a large screen area, could support the tank's weight. He spoke of speed, of surprise, of how his crazy idea could give the Allies the very time advantage they desperately lacked at the rivers. "Imagine," he might have said, pointing at a map, "tanks not waiting for bridges. They float. They emerge on banks where they are not expected and break through defenses before the enemy even realizes what's happened." His arguments were based not on pure fantasy, but on cold logic, engineering precision, and a deep understanding of physics. Gradually, his persistence began to break through the thick wall of disbelief. A few far-sighted officers, among whom might have been Percy Hobart, the famous creator of Hobart's Funnies, despite their internal resistance and the mockery of their colleagues, began to listen. Perhaps this eccentric oddball truly saw what they could not. Perhaps it was precisely in this madness, in this seeming absurdity, that the only solution lay to turn the tide on the Western Front. A seed of belief, barely perceptible, had been sown. Despite initial mockery and deeply entrenched skepticism, the spark of Nicholas Straussler's ingenious idea still ignited a flame of interest in some far-sighted military minds. It was British military engineers, tempered in the fire of the Battle of Britain and renowned for their willingness to embrace unconventional, sometimes audacious, solutions in the context of total war, who first grasped the true potential of the floating canvas. Among them was the legendary Major General Percy Hobart, whose name became synonymous with unorthodox military engineering. Nicknamed Hobart's Funnies for his eccentric but remarkably effective specialized tanks, known as Hobart's Funnies, he possessed the ability to see through the apparent absurdity of an idea to its practical value. Hobart, himself an innovator who converted ordinary tanks into mine flails, bridge layers, and flamethrowers, perfectly understood that in a war where every day brought new challenges and demanded immediate adaptation, only radical solutions could secure victory. It was thanks to his tireless support and the interest of the British command, and subsequently influential insiders within the American war machine, that the DD tank concept began its journey from a wild proposal to a combat-ready vehicle. The process of creating the first prototypes, officially named DD tank, duplex drive, was arduous, fraught with engineering puzzles and dramatic trials. From the initial schematic drawings to the floating structure, the path was long and filled with technical challenges that demanded colossal effort and persistence. Engineers and designers, working day and night under strict secrecy, experimented with various types of fabrics, frameworks, and drives. They sought the ideal combination of strength, waterproofing, lightness, and crucially, speed of deployment. Experimental M4 Shermans seemed to gain a new, surreal life as they were transported to secret proving grounds, where ponds, artificial canals, and lakes became their temporary battlefields. The initial attempts were far from perfect. The canvas screens sometimes tore under the immense water pressure during movement, or upon hitting uneven ground during immersion egress. Deployment mechanisms occasionally failed, leaving the tank vulnerable to water and the crew in a panic. Several Sherman prototypes nearly sank during trials, creating dramatic moments where it seemed the project was doomed, and skeptics were about to claim victory. The crews of the first testers were true daredevils, willing to risk their lives for an idea that still balanced on the fine line between genius and utter madness. However, every failure, every mishap, every near sinking became an invaluable lesson. Engineers meticulously dissected each incident, improving the design, reinforcing materials, and perfecting the mechanisms. Gradually, with each iteration, the design was refined. The rubberized fabrics became stronger, the steel framework more reliable, and the hydraulic systems more predictable. Ultimately, after hundreds of hours of intense work, countless calculations, trials, and errors, the engineers succeeded in creating a reliable, functional, and most importantly, practical design ready for mass production. The main components of this unique amphibious Sherman, capable of fundamentally altering the tactics of river crossings, this was not just a skirt, but a complex system consisting of a rigid steel or aluminum frame covered with a dense, multi-layered, rubberized fabric. Standing up to 2.4 meters, 8 feet, high, this screen could be raised or lowered in mere minutes using a hydraulic system or manual winches. When raised, it created a sealed, watertight volume around the tank's hull, significantly increasing its displacement and transforming the formidable 30-ton machine into something resembling a small, but surprisingly stable and unexpectedly swift boat. For propulsion in water, 2 propellers, typically 3-bladed, were installed at the rear of the tank. They were driven by the tank's main engine via a complex but reliable propeller shaft and a special gearbox that transmitted power to the propellers. This system allowed the tank to achieve a respectable speed for such a bulky design, up to 4 knots, about 7.4 kilometers per hour or 4.6 miles per hour, in relatively calm water. Steering in the aquatic environment was achieved by rotating the propellers, and in some modifications and early prototypes, by a small auxiliary rudder located between them. This demanded entirely new skills from the tank crews and a completely different understanding of maneuvering than on land. Training for waterborne operation became a separate, highly critical phase of preparation. The understanding that perfect water tightness was unattainable under combat conditions, or even in light chop, led to the integration of powerful electric bilge pumps. These were a critically important safety feature, capable of rapidly pumping out water that might enter behind the canvas screen due to splashes, waves, or even minor damage from enemy fire, preventing sinking and giving the crew a chance to reach the shore. Thus, step by step, from Nicholas Straussler's initial crazy proposal to a meticulously designed and tested structure, the DD tank transformed from a bold dream into a formidable, real combat machine, ready to change the course of the war. The very creation of the DD tank was only half the battle. There remained another, no less complex task, and perhaps even more perilous: teaching people to operate these extraordinary machines in their new, alien role. Tank crews, accustomed to the roar of the engine, the clang of tracks on solid ground, the precision of aiming on land, suddenly faced a completely new world. Their world was turned upside down when they had to learn to operate their 30-ton steel fortresses on water. Operating a tank in its floating state was an art not just unfamiliar but utterly alien. Unlike land maneuvering, where every movement of the track lever yielded an immediate and predictable response, on water, the DD tank behaved entirely differently. The steering, controlled by the propellers, was far less responsive and precise than the familiar track systems, and the inertia of the water created entirely different dynamic characteristics. Crews had to learn a completely different way of thinking, assessing the river current, wind, wave conditions, and accounting for the tank's delayed reaction to commands. Instead of the usual view from narrow vision slits or an open hatch surrounded by impenetrable armor, Their view was limited to a tall, up to 2.5 meters canvas screen. It was extremely difficult to orient themselves through it, especially at a distance, when the target was hidden by waves or the horizon of fabric. On water, the Sherman tank transformed from a nimble land predator into something between a cumbersome barge and a blind turtle, demanding an entirely different level of skill, patience, and intuition. These unique and vital training sessions took place under conditions of strict, absolute secrecy. Any leak of information about floating tanks could cost the Allies the element of surprise, the main trump card in upcoming operations. Secret proving grounds were located in remote, secluded bodies of water in Great Britain, such as Fritton Lake in Norfolk, or the testing facilities near Christchurch. The perimeter was heavily guarded by patrols. Aircraft flights over these zones were strictly forbidden, and the few civilian residents of nearby villages could only guess at the strange, muffled noises emanating from the lakes and the unusual outlines disappearing into the mist. Tank crews, selected from among the most experienced, disciplined, and psychologically resilient, were kept in complete isolation. Their correspondence was meticulously scrutinized. They were the first masters of a new, unique art of war, and their training was not just important, but a critical element of success. However, the biggest, and at times most exhausting, challenge to overcome was not technical, but a deep psychological barrier. Imagine a seasoned tank commander who had spent his entire service in a steel fortress on land, whose survival instincts were honed by years of combat, now ordered to launch this multi-ton machine into open water. Every instinct, every dogma, every experience screamed at him. It will sink. You will drown. Such a decision contradicted everything they knew about tanks, about physics, about war. A tank, in their understanding, was meant to sink like a stone, dragging its occupants to the bottom. The fear was real, palpable, and at times paralyzing. Many tankers experienced intense anxiety before their first immersion, especially in stormy weather or strong currents, when the canvas screen seemed incredibly fragile. Inside the tank, as the water began to slosh against the skirt and the tank itself gently swayed, the feeling of vulnerability was colossal. The sounds of water, the slap of waves against the screen, the gentle, unfamiliar to land rocking, the monotonous hum of the propellers, all of this was unsettling, frightening, and demanded immense fortitude. Instructors, many of whom were the first testers themselves, worked not only on operational skills but also on psychology, striving to instill in the crews an unshakable trust in this crazy, yet meticulously designed contraption. They began with short swims in calm conditions, where the water was smooth as a mirror, gradually increasing the distance, speed, and complexity of maneuvers. Each successful crossing, each tank safely reaching the shore and shedding its canvas cocoon, like a caterpillar transforming into a butterfly, bolstered the crew's confidence. They learned to trust the canvas screen, the hydraulic system, the rotating propellers, and most importantly, each other and their commanders. Gradually, fear receded, replaced by the realization that they possessed a unique technology that could not just save their lives, but fundamentally change the course of the war. From mere tank crews, they transformed into sea tankers, elite specialists ready to lead their steel machines across water obstacles, undeterred by the elements or the enemy. It was thanks to their courage, skill, and ability to overcome innate fear that Straussler's crazy idea got its chance for triumph in the coming, decisive battles. The early morning of June 6, 1944, dawn was breaking over the English Channel, a dawn that was destined to be not merely the start of a new day, but the dawn of a new era for an enslaved Europe, and the harbinger of the Third Reich's swift end. This was the largest amphibious operation in human history, Operation Overlord, and every single detail, from the smallest nut to the grandest strategic maneuver, had been meticulously planned down to the second. Every element, from the landing infantry to the supporting artillery, held critical strategic significance. But at the very heart of this monumental, unprecedented plan lay one of the most unorthodox and audacious military innovations: the DD tanks, Nicholas Straussler's swimming Shermans. Their role was absolutely critical: to provide immediate armored support to the first waves of assaulting infantry. Imagine the scene. Tens of thousands of young soldiers were to land directly on enemy beaches under a hail of fire from fortified positions. Without tanks capable of suppressing German machine gun nests, neutralizing artillery positions, and destroying the concrete bunkers that loomed over the beaches, the infantry would have been doomed to unimaginable, catastrophic losses in the very first minutes of the assault. The DD tanks were meant to be both a steel shield, covering the advancing troops from the storm of bullets, and a fiery fist, allowing the infantry to secure a foothold on the beachheads before the Wehrmacht could recover from the initial shock and unleash the full force of its counterattacks. This was not merely an auxiliary element, but a vital, key factor for the success of the entire Operation Overlord, the thin line between triumph and complete fiasco. On Utah Beach, one of the two American landing sectors, the early morning of June 6th became an unequivocal triumph of brilliant engineering foresight. By fortunate chance, or perhaps due to a more favorable geographical position, the sea swell here was relatively calm. Conditions for the deployment of DD tanks were almost ideal, descending into the water from massive LCT landing craft at a distance of approximately 3 kilometers, about 1.8 miles from the shore. The Shermans raised their canvas screens, as if unfurling gigantic yet awkward sails, and, propelled by their screws, began their slow but inexorable journey towards the French coast. Through the morning mist, mingled with the acrid smoke from naval artillery, they moved, resembling strange, ungainly sea monsters. When the first tanks began to emerge from the water, shedding their canvas skirts with a characteristic clatter and hydraulic hiss, and revealing their 75mm guns, it had an utterly stunning, demoralizing effect on the defending Germans. Instead of defenseless infantry, steel monsters rolled towards them, seemingly appearing directly from the sea, as if from nowhere. This element of surprise, this shock of tanks appearing where they simply couldn't be, demoralized the defending soldiers. The DD tanks quickly provided powerful fire support, immediately suppressing machine gun nests, snipers, and concrete bunkers, allowing the 4th Infantry Division's infantry to rapidly advance inland from the beachhead, minimizing casualties to an incredibly low level. Utah Beach became a brilliant, resounding confirmation of Straussler's concept, proving its viability under ideal conditions. However, just a few tens of kilometers to the east, on the infamous Omaha Beach, D-Day turned into one of the most dramatic failures for the swimming Shermans, and became one of the bloodiest episodes of the entire landing. Here, as if in mockery of human plans, a fierce storm raged. Massive waves reached 1.8 meters, 6 feet, in height, and a treacherous current swept vessels and tanks off course. Due to fears that the slow-moving LCT landing craft might be easily hit by long-range German artillery, the command made the fateful decision to launch the DD tanks into the water too far from the shore, approximately 5.5 kilometers, over 3 miles, from Omaha. This decision, made with good intentions, proved catastrophic. Amidst the storm, the fragile canvas screens could not withstand the powerful impacts of the waves. Water rapidly poured over them or seeped inside through gaps, overwhelming the internal pumps, which simply could not cope with such a volume. Dozens of DD tanks, desperately battling the elements, one after another began to sink into the icy waters of the English Channel, taking the lives of their crews with them into the abyss, as they often failed to escape from their sinking machines.
Of the 32 tanks designated for the first wave of attack on Omaha, only 2 managed to reach the shore independently, and 3 more were rescued by other vessels.
This was not just a failure, it was a heartbreaking tragedy, a bitter price paid for a risky, albeit ingenious, technology that encountered merciless natural conditions and a fatal error in planning. Omaha Beach served as a harsh, tragic reminder that even the most innovative solutions have their limitations and risks, especially when confronted with the brutal forces of nature and the chaos of war. Nevertheless, even this bitter experience did not negate the immense value of DD tanks. It merely underscored the need for meticulous planning, correct application conditions, and extreme attention to detail when employing such a revolutionary weapon. If the tragic experience of Omaha Beach served as a harsh lesson for the deployment of DD tanks, the subsequent months of the campaign to liberate Western Europe transformed these extraordinary machines into a true legend, demonstrating their genuine, revolutionary potential. After securing the Normandy beachheads, as the Allies began their rapid advance deep into the continent, they were destined to encounter the most extensive and sophisticated system of water obstacles in the world. Countless rivers and canals, the Seine, the Moselle, the Rhine, the Meuse, the Ems, each represented a new, formidable defensive line. And it was here, on these waterways, that Nicholas Straussler's swimming Shermans showcased their full glory, becoming a key, indispensable element for maintaining the relentless pace of the offensive. They were used en masse, often forming entire armored flotillas that appeared where the Germans absolutely did not expect them, literally emerging from nowhere. The crossing scenes were truly dramatic and surreal. German troops, taught by generations of military theorists that rivers were natural, powerful, and reliable defensive lines, systematically blew up bridges. Every truss span, every pier flew into the air. They mined the banks, set up anti-tank barriers, and established firing positions, carefully camouflaged in the riverside vegetation. The Wehrmacht's defensive doctrine presumed that tanks, these primary Allied assault forces, would be stopped by water, giving them ample time to regroup and fortify new positions. But instead, out of the morning mist, thick as milk, or in the stark glare of searchlights piercing the night's darkness over the wide expanse of water, suddenly appeared the slowly moving silhouettes of tanks, clumsy yet relentless Shermans, with their canvas skirts raised, like giant turtles or unknown sea monsters, slowly but surely glided across the water. The effect of surprise was not merely stunning, it was profoundly demoralizing. German soldiers who witnessed this for the first time could not believe their eyes. "Tanks! They're swimming? This is impossible! They're swimming!" they cried in bewilderment, and in their voices was not only shock but also a chilling realization of helplessness. Their faith in the impregnability of their positions, in the inviolability of the water barrier, shattered against a fantastical reality. Enemy armor was simply ignoring the water obstacle, passing through it. This psychological blow was almost as significant as the tactical one. The sight of tanks emerging from the water where they were least expected sowed panic, eroded morale, and undermined confidence in defensive capabilities. DD tanks allowed the time to overcome water obstacles to be reduced from hours or even days to minutes, where it previously took weeks of strenuous effort to build heavy pontoon bridges under continuous enemy fire, or long hours awaiting cumbersome and vulnerable heavy ferries. Shermans could now cross a river in just 10 to 20 minutes. This gave the Allies a colossal speed and tactical advantage. They could maintain a swift, continuous pace of advance, denying the Germans a chance to catch their breath, regroup, or organize a stable defense. DD tanks became masters of surprise. They bypassed fortified positions, landing in the most unexpected places, often on less protected sections of the river where the enemy had not anticipated the appearance of armor. They appeared on flanks or even deep in the rear, striking enemy headquarters, supply lines, and communications that were caught off guard and unable to mount an effective defense. This allowed for the rapid encirclement and cutting off of entire garrisons, the breaching of supply lines, and the sowing of panic, creating an effect of lightning warfare unseen since the German blitzkriegs of the early war. No less, and perhaps even more important, was the saving of human lives. The rapid and effective crossings provided by DD tanks significantly reduced casualties among the infantry. Instead of landing under machine gun fire on an open beach without any armored support, soldiers could now advance behind the tanks or even alongside them, knowing that the steel machines were nearby. The tanks immediately suppressed enemy firing positions, clearing the way. This not only saved invaluable lives but also boosted morale, knowing that even a water barrier would not deprive them of protection and firepower. DD tanks became one of the key factors that made the campaign to liberate Europe less bloody for the Allies than it might have been without this crazy idea. Thus, DD tanks, born from Nicholas Straussler's eccentric idea and overcoming resistance, mockery, and skepticism, proved their immense value on the battlefields of Europe. They became a symbol of engineering genius and adaptability, capable of transforming a seemingly insurmountable barrier into a high-speed highway for armored columns, hastening the end of the war and demonstrating that in critical moments, innovations, even the most unconventional ones, can be absolutely decisive for victory. The concluded Second World War left indelible scars on the face of the entire world. Yet paradoxically, it also became a catalyst for an unprecedented scope of human ingenuity, resilience, and engineering genius. In this maelstrom of fire, steel, and innovation, DD tanks, Nicholas Straussler's swimming Shermans, earned their unique and, rightfully, heroic place. They were not the most powerful weapons of destruction or the most heavily armored machines on the battlefield, but their strategic and tactical contribution to the victory on the Western Front was truly invaluable. They became a brilliant symbol of Allied adaptability and engineering genius, vividly demonstrating that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable natural obstacles, wide, turbulent rivers transformed into deadly traps, one could find not just a way out, but a completely unexpected, revolutionary path. DD tanks allowed the rapid, deadly pace of the offensive to be maintained, bypassing German fortifications that were previously considered impregnable, and most importantly, saving thousands of priceless lives that would have been inevitably lost in traditional, frontal river crossings under fire. The attitude towards Nicholas Straussler, this crazy engineer from Budapest, underwent truly fundamental changes. A man whose eccentric ideas were initially met with smirks, ridicule, and deep-seated disbelief, whose proposal to make a tank float on canvas seemed sheer absurdity and a sure path to suicide, was now recognized not just as a talented engineer, but as a true genius. His crazy idea, born at the intersection of automotive engineering and military science, proved to be one of the most groundbreaking, effective, and ultimately life-saving solutions of the entire war. He didn't just create a new machine, he created a fundamentally new capability that changed the tactics of an entire campaign, allowing armies to move where they were not expected. From skepticism to triumph, Straussler's journey was a metaphor for all wartime invention. The story of the DD tank is not just a dry list of technical specifications or a chronicle of combat operations. It is much more. It is a profound and inspiring narrative about the power of unconventional thinking, about how one person's courage to challenge accepted norms, outdated dogmas, and even basic notions of what is possible can not only overcome bureaucratic barriers and stubborn skepticism, but literally change the course of history. World War II, with all its destructive power and monstrous cost, showed humanity. True strength lies not only in brute force, in tons of steel, in the caliber of guns, or the destructive power of explosives. It lies, first and foremost, in the flexibility of mind, in the capacity for adaptation and innovation, in the emergence of those crazy ideas that allow seemingly insurmountable obstacles to be overcome and seemingly unbreakable dogmas to be circumvented. And thanks to one such engineer, whose imagination knew no bounds, whose persistence was unyielding, American tanks learned to cross rivers in minutes, transforming water barriers from deadly obstacles into high-speed highways. This hastened the end of the bloodiest war in human history, leaving behind an eternal lesson. True victory is often born not on the battlefield, but in the minds of those who dare to dream the impossible.